Hey, what's up guys, TechTine here and I'm back again with a brand new video. So if this is your first time on the channel, don't make it your last. Make sure you click on that subscribe button. Also like this video if you found it useful. But in today's video, I'm finally doing the comparison between the Galaxy S23 FE to the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G. Now these phones technically are not supposed to be on equal footing, but trust me, by the time you finish watching this video, you'll kind of see that they're really close. Closer than you think. So we're going to discuss the design, the specs, the performance, the camera quality, the display, and I'll give you guys a conclusion on which phone I would personally pick and see which one would you guys pick. But let's begin with the design of the Galaxy A54 5G. So this is kind of a familiar design. Let's call it that. Let's call it a familiar design. So the back is made out of glass, so a really nice glossy material. Some may like it, some may hate it. I'm not really a big fan of glossy material, but it's here. It is what it is at that point. But it is made out of glass versus the plastic that they used on the A53 5G in the previous generation. So definitely stepped it up as far as quality of materials go. And on the back you do also get this Samsung logo as well as your triple camera setup, which we will definitely talk about later on in the video. In the bottom of the phone houses your bottom facing speaker as well as two microphones and your fast USB-C port. And it can support up to 25 watt of wired charging. So no wireless charging, only wired charging here around. But you do get a hefty battery, which we will talk about in the performance aspect of the phone. So if you look at the right hand side, you do also get your power button as well as your volume up and down. Now they are on the smaller side. And listen, they're good, right? They're not the most tactile buttons that you'll ever use, but they're definitely good for what they are. So they are made out of plastic, and that's just the story behind this phone. So the back is made out of glass, but the entire sides of the phone are made out of plastic. So that's where kind of Samsung took a couple of cuts in the price, so that way they can make this phone a little bit more affordable. Overall though, as a design, like I said, it matches the theme of their Galaxy S lineup. So it definitely gets a thumbs up in that regard. Very close, other than the sides that are made out of plastic, but honestly I don't really mind. They make the phone a little bit lighter. Okay, so switching it up, and let's talk about the Galaxy S23 FE's design. So again, very similar aesthetic to the A54, to their S23 lineup of phones, other than the S23 Ultra, of course. So again, very similar story. The back is made out of glass, and it also houses your triple camera setup, which we will cover later on in a video. But the back in general is glossy, can catch fingerprints, and that goes for both the A54 and the Galaxy S23 FE. So a case is recommended if you want to keep this phone clean and protected for the most part. Now the big upgrade here as far as design is the sides and the camera rings. So the sides are made out of metal, higher quality material. Obviously it will add weight, so there's definitely a downside to that. So it's up to you to decide whether you feel like the metal is worth the weight that this phone will add, which we will talk about also when we compare these phones side by side. The other thing is also the fact that the camera rings around the phone do have metal around them instead of plastic, so that's also a thumbs up in the upgraded design. A little bit more premium. And the bottom of the phone does have, again, your USB-C that support 25 watt charging, two microphones, your bottom facing speaker, but this time around you do get wireless charging. Overall though, as a design, you may like it, you may hate it, but me personally, I think it's just as good as the A54. But now let's put them side by side to see how they really stack up. So you may think when putting them side by side that there are really not that many differences, but there are definitely subtle differences here and there. So let's talk a little bit about them. One of the first things that you will notice if you put them side by side is the different shade of gray that they used. So the A54 is a little bit darker than the S23 FE. That's the first thing that you will notice. Now as far as thickness go, they're both the same thickness at 8.2 millimeters. And as far as weight, you will definitely notice the difference. So the S23 FE comes in at 208 grams versus the 202 grams of the Galaxy A54 5G. And as far as the quality of material, obviously S23 FE does have the A54 5G beat in that regard. So metal versus plastic. Now there's also a downside between having metal and plastic. That's up to you to decide, honestly. If you're fine with having a heavier phone, then go with the S23 FE. If you're not, A54 is your friend. So as far as also the port selection goes, if you notice at the bottom, they both have the similar speakers, similar USB-C ports, but the microphone cutout is slightly further apart from the USB-C port on the A54 versus the S23 FE. I mean, obviously that's not really that big of a deal, but it's one of the subtle changes. Now, a change that I feel like is useful on the S23 FE is the fact that the power button and the volume up and down are shifted a little bit up for easier reach. And the power button and the volume up and down, because they're made out of metal, they are a little bit more clicky and tactile, so definitely better quality buttons in that regard. And also the other thing that I want to talk about is the camera rings around the A54 are made out of plastic versus the metal camera rings around the S23 FE. So overall though, as far as the design goes, I don't think you'll be disappointed with either choice, whether you want the A54 or the S23 FE. Obviously the S23 FE does use a little bit more premium materials just because it does have the S badge with it, I guess, but that doesn't mean that the A54 uses really cheap material. I mean, yeah, it's plastic, but if you think about it, it does make it a little bit lighter in the hand. So for longer use, the A54 may be your best friend versus the S23 FE. But yeah, as far as design, I don't think you'll be disappointed with either or if you're in the market for a Galaxy A54 or Galaxy S23 FE. Now let's go ahead and switch the conversation and talk about the display. So the Galaxy A54 5G has the following display. So you do get a 6.4-inch 2340 by 1080p display, and it does support 120 Hz refresh rate. It is very bright, so you get 1000 nits of peak brightness, HDR10 plus. So you do have 82.9% screen to body ratio, 403 ppi, Corning Gorilla Glass 5, so it's definitely the real deal. And as far as this display, you will not be disappointed at all. So using this display was a joy. So obviously Samsung knew what they're doing when they made the display for this phone. Obviously it's not like the best display in the world, it's not a higher resolution 2K display, it still is 1080p, but for the most part that's good enough for pretty much a lot of people. If I would say so myself, it's good enough for me. I don't really care for a 2K display because it's at that point it would be really hard to tell the difference anyway. And we can't forget about the in-display fingerprint that the A54 provides as well. So overall, very happy, as well as you should be happy with this display. Now let's talk a little bit about the Galaxy S23 FE's display. Again, similar story, believe it or not, 6.4 inches 2340 by 1080p display panel that has a little bit higher peak brightness, so 1450 nits, so definitely brighter. Still supports 120 Hz refresh rate, HDR10 plus, and so it's really hard to tell the difference. We'll put them side by side, but the S23 FE does have 83.2% screen to body ratio, still at 403 pixels per inch, still using Corning Gorilla Glass 5. So putting these phones side by side, just off of looks alone, it's really hard to tell which one has the better display, because frankly, as far as resolution and as far as quality, for the most part they have pretty good quality displays, and you cannot go wrong with either one of these phones, whether you want the S23 FE or the A54 5G. But there are some differences that we must discuss. The first of which is the bezel size. So ever so slightly, the S23 FE does have a higher screen to body ratio. So it's at 83.2% for the S23 FE versus the 82.9%. So it's so slight that I don't really think you can tell the difference even when you look at them side by side and even if you zoom in. Now, the other thing that I noticed is that the S23 FE does have slightly warmer tone colors. I guess you can adjust that in the settings, but that's just something that I wanted to mention. Also, in addition to that, the S23 FE does have the higher peak brightness display, so it will be better used for outdoor conditions at a brighter situation. So that's also something to note. But overall though, the experience itself, I don't think you'll go wrong with either one of these phones. It was really hard to kind of see which one has the better display just by looking at them, and I really had to, take them to the outdoor conditions to be able to tell that the S23 FE just has a brighter display. That's about it. Other than that, the quality itself is very nice on both of these devices. So not really that big of a difference in that regard other than the brightness. So now let's finally compare the camera experiences on both of these phones. So the A54 has a 50 megapixel main sensor. You have also an 8 megapixel macro sensor. You also have a 12 megapixel ultra wide as well as a 5 megapixel macro sensor, and this phone can shoot up to 4K at 30 frames per second, 1080p at 30 or 60, or even 720p slow-mo at 480 frames per second, a front-facing camera of 32 megapixels. When it comes to picture quality though, this phone is not as saturated as a lot of these Samsung devices that we see nowadays. Don't get me wrong, it still is a little bit saturated, but in my cases, the phone kind of tends to in some scenarios overexpose, and the colors are not just as vivid or as vibrant as I like them to be. But don't get me wrong though, this phone takes still some really good pictures overall as a package, and even dynamic range is a little bit on the softer sides, and obviously the wide angle does take a hit, so it's not really the best wide angle lens that you'll see out there. So overall though, I'm not trying to say that this is going to be a bad camera. This is still a really solid camera for the money. It still is in the mid-range side of things. So keep your expectations at that. It's not going to be the greatest quality of cameras, but it's going to do its job and it's going to do it well enough for, I would say, a lot of people's needs. So let's go ahead and switch the topic of conversation and talk about the S23 FE's camera. And this is where this phone tends to take a step ahead of the A54 5G. So a triple camera setup, you get a 50 megapixel main sensor, 8 megapixel telephoto sensor instead of that macro sensor, which the telephoto and the main sensor both support optical image stabilization. The telephoto does have 3 times optical zoom, and you also get a 12 megapixel ultra wide at 123 degrees field of view. You get 8K video recording at 24 frames per second. You get 4K at 30, 60 frames per second, 1080p at 30, 60, 120, and 240, and super slow-mo 720p at 960 frames per second. So there's a lot of things that are going on with this camera, and you get a lot of options in the settings where you can control pro video and pro photo mode. As far as the image quality goes, it is noticeably better than the A54. So if you're looking at these phones strictly for the camera experience, this phone will do it better. So the S23 FE is that much better of a camera. So you get better colors, better saturation, better vibrant in pictures, better dynamic range. And for whatever reason, it is sharper on the S23 FE versus the A54 5G. You get the advantage of a telephoto lens if you plan on using it. You get advantage of better stabilization in your videos, and you get better night photography. So as a package, the S23 FE is better. Putting them side by side though, here's what I have to say about the camera experience themselves. The S23 FE is better, no question about it. However, the A54 does still do a good job. So don't just write off the A54 just because it has a worse quality camera experience than the S23 FE. So just from the camera experience though, overall you do get more on the S23 FE. So let's close the books on that one. Alright, so now let's go ahead and talk about the performances of both of these phones. So beginning with the Galaxy A54 5G, you do get the Exynos 1380 based on a 5nm architecture, the Mali G68 GPU, 128GB of storage, 6GB of RAM. There's also a 4GB RAM option, but the one that I have is 6GB of RAM. And you can upgrade it to up to 256GB of storage or 128GB storage, 8GB of RAM. So it just depends on what model you pick. Versus the S23 FE that has the Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor if you buy it in the United States based on a 4nm architecture. You have also the Adreno 730 GPU, 128GB of storage, 8GB of RAM base model. You can upgrade it to 256GB of storage. So here's what I have to say about the performances of this phone. It's also another point where the S23 FE just beats the A54 point blank. That's just what it is. However, funny enough, Galaxy A54 5G does have the bigger battery at 5000 mAh battery versus the Galaxy S23 FEs that is only at 4500 mAh battery. The reason being the fact that the S23 FE has a smaller battery is because of the addition of wireless charging. So you will sacrifice battery life, but you will get wireless charging. You tell me if that's a benefit to you or not, but the battery life is better on the A54, slightly low. It's not really a massive difference. Okay. The other thing that I want to talk about is this though. In the performance aspect, opening up daily tasks on both of these phones is smooth, good. So daily tasks aside, the S23 FE will have the better processor. It will have the higher RAM for as far as like kind of the base model goes. But overall, listen, the S23 FE will give you a better longevity performance. I was never big a fan of the Exynos processors. I'm still not. So the S23 FE is the better performer easily. Okay, so now let me give you guys my conclusion on both of these phones and which one you should pick up. I would personally pick up the S23 FE. Now, if you're looking at these phones and you're only thinking about just the design and the way these phones look or the display, then you wouldn't go wrong with either one of these. It would not be a problem from that regard. Yeah, there's a quality material difference, but design and looks the same. Display for the most part the same. The S23 FE is slightly brighter, but off of performance and the camera experience, the S23 is just way better. That's just what it is. So for the overall package, that's why I would personally pick the S23 FE versus the A54. But put this thought in your mind. The A lineup of the Galaxy devices and the S lineup of the Galaxy devices again are really closing up on each other. So honestly, if the A54 had similar camera quality and closer, better chipset performance, I would pick the A54 over the S23 FE. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, leave a thumbs up. Make sure you click on the subscribe button, and I will catch you guys in the next video really soon. Thank you all so much for watching.